What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. We continue here with our schedule preview and projected record series for the upcoming 2024 season. Kansas State is up next. Before we get to the projections, let's look back at the 2023 schedule, and here it was. Of course, they played Missouri in the non-conference. They did have one pretty tough non-conference game there. And then you look at the rest of their schedule in the Big 12. Moving ahead to 2024, this is what the schedule will look like. And keep in mind, this Arizona game is a non-conference game. I know it's weird, but Kansas State and Arizona will play in the non-conference because that game was scheduled before Arizona joined the Big 12, and they decided to keep it on the schedule but not count it as a conference game. So they'll play UT Martin at Tulane and then Arizona at home in a game that will not count in the Big 12 standings. Their home schedule, those games, UT Martin, Arizona, then Oklahoma State, Kansas, Arizona State, and Cincinnati. So they get two big games at home with both Oklahoma State and Kansas. That is good news for the Wildcats. Their road schedule: at Tulane, at BYU, at Colorado, West Virginia, Houston, and Iowa State. A very manageable road schedule. Toughest game might be West Virginia. Yeah, Kansas State's schedule sets up pretty well as we go week by week. They'll start with UT Martin on August 31st. Then it's at Tulane September 7th. This is not going to be the same Tulane team that we've seen the last few years. So that they got them at the right time. Let's just say that. Arizona on the 14th. And again, that game will not count in the Big 12 conference standings. They'll play BYU on the road September 21st. And then Oklahoma State on the 28th. So they'll play 5 games before they get their first bye week. First bye week comes before a trip to Colorado. So pretty good spot for that bye week. We go to Colorado. Not sure how good this team's going to be. We expect them to at least be competitive in the Big 12. West Virginia on the road on the 19th. That's a tough back-to-back. Going all the way to Colorado, then all the way to West Virginia. That is a very tough back-to-back road trip there. They'll play Kansas next at home on the 26th. Then they go on the road to play Houston on November 2nd. Then they get another bye week before playing Arizona State at home and Cincinnati at home on the 23rd. And finally, Iowa State on the road November 30th. Well, you'd like to have this schedule set up a little bit differently. You'd like to maybe have, let's just switch West Virginia and Arizona State on the schedule. How much better would it then be? Because then you'd have at Colorado after a bye week. Then you'd have a home game against Arizona State. And then you'd have a bye week before going to West Virginia, but that's not how it worked out. So again, a tough spot in the schedule there from Colorado really down to Kansas, those 3 games in a row. They get a break though at the end with Arizona State and Cincinnati at home, a little bit easier schedule. But I think it's really going to be about the start of the season against the game against Arizona, BYU on the road, Oklahoma State. Those 3 games I think are going to really set the tone for the season. They definitely have a chance to win all 3. But it would shock me if they lost 2 of those 3. So that's going to set the tone. If you start 5-0, even if they lose, let's say to Colorado or West Virginia, that's just 1 loss. And going down the stretch, again, a schedule that's not too tough. So overall, yeah, some things that I don't like about the schedule, but overall, it's not a very tough schedule. So let's get to the projections now. They were 8-4 last season. Our projection had them at 8-4. I personally predicted them to go 9-3. Thought they were going to have a little bit better of a season than they did. Athlon had them at 8-4. The over-under was actually anywhere from 7.5 to 8.5, so it kind of varied. If you could have gotten that 8.5, obviously the under was a pretty good pick. Even though I did pick them to go 9-3, so I guess the better pick was actually getting the 7.5 and going with the over. But you know, this team, they had a pretty good season last year, an 8-4 record. I think they were closer to 9-3 than they were to 7-5. So let's look at the projections for this season. This is the scale that we use. If it's less than 20 or over 80, those are games where I think this is pretty much a guaranteed win or loss. 20 to 29, 71 to 80. These are games where I think the spread is going to be double digits, 14 to 16, you know, maybe in that range, 30 to 39, 61 to 70%. These are the games where I think the spread's going to be closer to a touchdown. And then the 50-50 games, they'll stay in the white. This is that 40 to 60% range, and these are really games that could go either way. So we will start with the easy wins, and I think you've only got one. You've got UT Martin. That should be a pretty easy game there. Playing at home, FCS team, don't really expect them to have much trouble in that one. Then we move on to I think Tulane. Tulane is a game that I'm going to put in the blue as well as Cincinnati. I realize Tulane probably not going to be what they have been, not going to be as good as they have been, but still good enough. And the game being on the road, where I think this is one where Kansas State's probably favored by a couple of touchdowns, but maybe not by 20 plus. And I think Cincinnati is another game where they should be favored by 12, 13 points. They're playing at home. Cincinnati, maybe the worst team in the Big 12. So you've got two games there that, again, I think they'll be favored in by a decent amount. And then I think you've also got Arizona State. That's a game where they will be a clear favorite by about a touchdown, 7 or 8 points maybe in that game. So 4 games where they should be favorites, and I think it's pretty clear that they will be favorites in these games. You look at the rest of the schedule, and it's really just a bunch of 50-50 games. Now, if you want to nitpick here, there's definitely some of these games I think there's a clear favorite. I think BYU, Kansas State should be favored in that game, but it's on the road, and again, with the tier system that we use, BYU is a tier below Kansas State, but when you've got the game on the road, that flips that to a 50-50 game. And kind of the same story with Houston. Kansas State, I think, is going to be much better than Houston, but games on the road, I think Kansas State will be favored, and in both of those games, BYU and Houston, but not by a ton. And I think it's enough to make those games 50-50 games, even though, I'll just go ahead and tell you, I'm going to pick Kansas State more than likely to win both of those games. Colorado's a little bit of a different story. They're in the same tier as BYU and Houston, but I think they have more potential. So that's one that I can actually buy a little bit more, being a 50-50 game. And then you got Arizona. That should be an even matchup. Oklahoma State, a pretty even matchup. Kansas. All of those games at home. So that's good news. You get all those big games at home. Iowa State's going to be a tough one. That's a tough place to play. And they might actually be underdogs in that game. And then West Virginia is going to be a tough one. And they might be an underdog in that game. It's kind of hard to say. If I just had to pick which games they'll be favored in, we've got the 4 here, obviously. I think because Arizona's at home, they're probably favored there. I think BYU, they're probably favored there. Oklahoma State, I think they're probably favored because it's at home. Colorado, I think they're probably favored there. West Virginia, that's a tough one. I think that's really one where maybe Kansas State's a 3-point underdog. Kansas is at home, so I think they'll be favored there. Houston, I think they'll be favored there. And then Iowa State, that's another tough one. So you're talking about West Virginia and Iowa State being the 2 games where they might be an underdog, and maybe they won't even be. That means, this sets up pretty well for Kansas State. But when we do our projection, we do our formula, we have to average all this out. And yes, there are a lot of games here where I think they're going to be favored, but these are not games where they're going to be a huge favorite, and they could lose these games. And when you calculate it all out, we actually get a 7-5 projection. So 7-5, the projection for Kansas State. Again, I think they're definitely going to do better than that, but just with the formula that we use, that's how it comes out. 7-5, just because you have a lot of games that they could potentially lose, even though I think most people would say they're probably going to win these games. Now, they could lose. Arizona is a losable game. Oklahoma State's a losable game. I'll even go with Colorado and West Virginia. Kansas, a losable game. Iowa State. So you've got 6 games that they could very realistically lose. So they could go 7-5. But again, I think they'll probably do better. But that's the projection with our formula. Love to get your thoughts on Kansas State and what you would project their record to be right now. Again, it's early. We'll do our predictions later. But give me your thoughts on this team down in the comments below.